Marta Montenegro was 68 years old when she realized that a mother's love could sometimes be the most painful trap of all. For decades, she had been a seamstress, one of those who transformed scraps into dresses and silence into comfort. Widowed by Alberto Montenegro, an honest businessman who built a construction company with effort and principles, Marta believed life owed her a break after his departure. But the absence of the man who protected her left a void that was not only emotional, but also practical. She sold her small apartment, the one where the walls still smelled of thread and coffee, and gave the money to her son, Rodrigo. She did so with the blind faith of a mother who confuses love with trust, believing they were forming a family partnership. Rodrigo spoke of investment, of the future, of continuing his father's legacy, and Marta, with the tenderness of someone who has already lost too much, accepted without question. The first few months were gentle, almost deceptively happy. Fabiana, her daughter-in-law, treated her with studied sweetness, the kind of kindness that feels more like surveillance than affection. Marta had her room at the back of the house, a room that used to be the tool shed, and spent her afternoons knitting or mending the school uniforms of her grandchildren, Pietro and Alice. But little by little, the laughter at the table faded, and Marta's presence began to be treated like a shadow. Rodrigo no longer asked her for advice, and Fabiana corrected her with a tone that disguised humiliation as care. Marta noticed, but remained silent. She always thought that silence was a form of love. She didn't know that, in reality, it was the beginning of her erasure. As the years passed, the house she had helped build became hostile territory. Marta began to feel like a guest in her own home. Family conversations took place without her. Decisions were made behind closed doors, and even the children unwittingly learned not to knock on her door without permission. Meals were served before she arrived at the table, and the words, "Grandma doesn't understand modern things anymore," became a constant refrain. Sometimes, when the silence weighed more than the memories, Marta would sit on the edge of her bed and think about Alberto, about how he had promised her she would always be protected. It was a promise broken by death, but betrayed by the living. Every night, her mind was filled with the echoes of distant laughter that no longer belonged to her. The final humiliation came one Sunday afternoon. Rodrigo entered her room without knocking, his eyes filled with an impatience she had never seen before. Fabiana stood behind him, arms crossed, her gaze a mixture of contempt and anticipated relief. "Mom, we need the room," Rodrigo said in a tense voice. "Fabiana is pregnant and there's no room." Marta stood motionless, holding a needle in the air, as if time had stopped. The sentence fell like a thud. Her son, the one for whom she had given up her own roof, was kicking her out of the house that existed thanks to her. There were no screams, no tears. Just a silence so dense it seemed to suck the air out of the room. Marta looked up and nodded. Then, with a serenity no one expected, she began packing her life into a small suitcase. Rodrigo didn't know how to react to his mother's calm. He expected reproaches, tears, perhaps a plea. But what he saw was a dignified silence, a strength that bothered him more than any words. Marta folded her clothes slowly, with the precision of someone who has spent her life organizing the chaos of others. She put away her sewing scissors, her thread, a rosary, and an old photo of Alberto on his wedding day. She didn't take anything else. When she passed Fabiana, she moved only a step away, avoiding her gaze. Marta crossed the aisle without looking back. As she closed the door from the outside, she noticed that her heart wasn't beating with sadness, but with a strange clarity. For the first time in a long time, she felt that something inside her had been released. Outside, the São Paulo sky was covered in a gray that promised rain. Marta thought about calling a taxi, but before she could take out her phone, a black car pulled up in front of the gate. A man with silver hair and an elegant demeanor got out. Enrique Montenegro, her late husband's former business partner. His presence seemed like a mirage, an apparition from the past. Enrique greeted her with a mixture of respect and restrained emotion. "Let's get out of here," he said in a calm voice, opening the car door. Marta looked at him for a few seconds before accepting. That simple gesture, an open door in the middle of the storm, would be the beginning of a truth that would change everything she thought she knew about her life, her son, and Alberto's legacy. During the journey, Marta remained silent, staring out the window as the city lights blurred on the wet glass. Enrique, sitting next to her, didn't say much, just watched her out of the corner of his eye with a mixture of concern and nostalgia. When they arrived at his house, an old residence in Higienopolis, smelling of wood and memories, he offered her a cup of hot tea. "You don't have to explain anything to me," he murmured softly. Marta accepted the tea, and her trembling hands found warmth in the porcelain. She didn't understand why, after so many years, he was still there, willing to help her without asking for anything in return. But what she didn't know was that Enrique kept a secret that he had promised to reveal only if Marta ever needed him. That night, as the wind battered the windows, Enrique handed her a folder wrapped in gray paper. Inside were old documents, notarized copies, contracts, and something that took her breath away: Alberto Montenegro's original will. Marta read the names and numbers in disbelief. The will named her as the owner of 40% of the family business's shares as well, as the heir to the land where the house she'd now been evicted was built. Rodrigo, according to the documents, had forged signatures and altered records to keep everything for himself. "He knew it from the beginning," Enrique said in a bitter voice. Marta felt the ground disappear beneath her feet, but instead of crying, she took a deep breath. For the first time, she wasn't going to stay silent. Marta spent the night without sleeping, sitting in the armchair in Enrique's office, the documents spread out in front of her like pieces of a puzzle that had always been incomplete. Each forged signature, each tampered with seal, was a fresh wound. She couldn't understand how Rodrigo, her own son, had been capable of such a thing. She remembered the times he had spoken to her about starting things together, about honoring the memory of his father, and realized it had all been a strategy to keep what didn't belong to her. In that instant, she understood that love, without limits, can become a form of destruction. Enrique, seeing her so serene and broken at the same time, said something she would never forget. "Sometimes, Marta, forgiving isn't forgetting. It's letting the truth defend itself." The next morning, she accepted his help. Together they visited Enrique's trusted lawyer, Dr. Otavio, a meticulous man with white hair and thick glasses that seemed to weigh down his thoughts. He reviewed the documents in silence for several minutes before saying, "This is clear. Fraud. If you decide to act, you'll have everything to gain." Marta listened to him, but her mind was far away. She wasn't thinking about money or revenge. She only wanted to clear Alberto's name, regain her dignity, and above all, not allow the lie to be the last legacy her family would remember. When she signed the authorization to initiate the legal process, her hands were no longer shaking. It had taken a lifetime to get to this point, but she was finally ready to defend herself. In the following weeks, Marta immersed herself in a world that had been foreign to her until then: law firms, meetings, sealed papers, and sworn statements. Enrique accompanied her at all times, maintaining a respectful but constant distance. Over cold coffees and folders full of evidence, a silent complicity grew between them, woven by years of shared history and wounds that never fully healed. He had loved Marta since before Alberto chose her, and seeing her suffer like that awakened in him something more than tenderness, a deep sense of justice. Marta, however, only thought of her grandchildren. Every night before going to sleep, she wondered if they knew that their grandmother was fighting not for money, but for the right to be remembered with respect. The day he received official notification of the case, Rodrigo exploded. He called his mother, insulting her with a rage that can only be born of guilt. He told her she had betrayed him, that she was destroying him, that she was a selfish old woman. Marta listened to everything in silence, holding the phone firmly. When he finished, she answered in a voice so calm it froze the air. "The only thing I'm destroying, Rodrigo, is the lie you built around your father's name." Then she hung up. Outside, the rain began to fall heavily, as if the sky wanted to wash away what remained of that relationship. It was at that moment that Marta realized she was no longer afraid. The love that had once made her vulnerable was now her source of courage. The first hearing was a trial by fire. Marta arrived accompanied by Henrique and Dr. Otavio, dressed in a dark blue suit she had sewn herself years before. In the courtroom, Rodrigo avoided her gaze, his face pale and his hands sweaty. Fabiana, on the other hand, held his gaze with a mixture of mockery and defiance. When the judge called for silence, Marta spoke firmly, without a single hesitation. She explained how she had trusted her son, how she had been deceived and deprived, and how, despite everything, she wasn't seeking revenge, but the truth. Her every word resonated in the courtroom with the force of someone who doesn't need to shout to be heard. When she finished, even the judge lowered his gaze for a moment, as if embarrassed by others. That same afternoon, Fabiana began her counterattack. She filed a false complaint alleging that Marta had threatened her and that she feared for her safety and that of her children. The blow was low, but calculated. For a few days, the news circulated on social media and among neighbors. Violent elderly woman confronts her daughter-in-law over money. Marta unwittingly became the center of a public spectacle she hadn't asked for. But she didn't break. Enrique and the lawyer counseled her to be patient. The truth needs time to make its mark, Otavio told her. And while others vilified her, Marta clung to a calm that only those who have lost everything can understand. That calm that precedes the storms. That cleanse. Enrique, driven by a mixture of indignation and silent love, began to act from the shadows. Without Marta's knowledge, he began discreetly buying up the debts that Rodrigo's company had accumulated with banks and suppliers. He did it with the precision of a surgeon and the patience of an old strategist. Each signed document brought him closer to a clear goal: to return to Marta the power that had been taken from her. When he finally confessed what he was doing, she remained silent for a long time. "I don't want to destroy my son," she said in a whisper. Enrique nodded. "You won't," she replied, "but you will teach him that life is not inherited, it is honored." Marta's eyes filled with tears, not from sadness, but from the certainty that there was still someone willing to believe in her dignity. Meanwhile, Fabiana didn't stop. She hired an aggressive lawyer, leaked manipulated information, and tried to portray herself as a victim in the local media. But her mask began to crack. The children, Pietro and Alice, began showing signs of emotional neglect, poor grades, anxiety, nightmares. The school notified the court, and that became a crack through which the truth began to leak. Marta, upon learning of this, felt not hatred, but profound sadness. Not for Fabiana, but for her son, who had become complicit in the pain she herself had suffered. At that moment, she understood that the battle was no longer merely legal, it was moral, and she was determined to win it. With the only weapon they could never take away from her, her serenity. Dr. Otavio, with his characteristic discretion, decided to expand the investigation. He hired a forensic accountant and a private detective, convinced that what was visible on the surface was only part of the deception. Within a few weeks, evidence began to appear like pieces of a perverse puzzle. Fabiana had not only manipulated Rodrigo, but had also embezzled company funds, sold jewelry belonging to the Montenegro family, and transferred money to an account in the name of a certain Julio Cesar, her personal trainer. When Marta saw the photographs confirming the relationship between them, she felt a strange emptiness. Not anger, not surprise, but the bitter certainty that lies, once they establish a home, eventually devour everything. Otavio suggested to Marta that they use the evidence prudently, but she decided to wait. She wanted to do it at the right moment, not out of revenge, but to close the cycle with dignity. Enrique silently supported her, admiring her composure. "You have the soul of a queen," he told her one evening as they walked through her garden. Marta smiled for the first time in a long time. "No," she replied, "I have the soul of a mother tired of keeping quiet." That phrase would mark the beginning of the end. Because the next morning, Marta requested a formal meeting with all the parties involved in Ottavio's office. She wanted to confront them face to face, in the cold, honest light of truth. The day of the meeting dawned clear, with a relentless sun that contrasted with the tension in the air. Marta arrived early, dressed in an impeccable beige outfit, simple but elegant, as if her presence alone was enough to command respect. Enrique silently accompanied her while Ottavio organized the documents and projections. Shortly after, Rodrigo entered with a frown, avoiding looking at his mother. Fabiana, on the other hand, appeared smiling, wearing dark glasses and a perfume so strong it seemed a declaration of power. When everyone was present, Ottavio closed the door and said, "Let's begin." Marta didn't speak immediately. She waited for the silence to sink in. Then, with a calmness that surprised everyone, she asked for the projector to be turned on. The first images showed bank transfers, messages, and photographs. Fabiana's face tensed as each piece of evidence appeared on the screen. Rodrigo began to sweat. He tried to interrupt, but Ottavio stopped him. With a curt gesture, "This," Marta finally said, "is not to humiliate you, Rodrigo. I'm doing this so you remember who you were before you let yourself be bought by lies." His voice didn't tremble, not even when he showed the most compelling evidence, a document with his forged signature. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Fabiana looked to Rodrigo for support, but he, with his blank stare, understood that he had lost much more than an inheritance. He had lost the trust of the only person who had loved him unconditionally. Rodrigo slumped in his chair, his hands covering his face. It was as if the full weight of his years had suddenly fallen upon him. "What have I done?" he murmured, barely audible. Fabiana, on the other hand, kept her face straight, denying everything with calculated insolence. "This is all a trap," she cried, but her voice sounded hollow. Ottavio calmly interrupted her, showing her the recordings and receipts that directly linked her to the embezzlement. Marta didn't need to say more. His silence, dignified and firm, was the harshest sentence of all. Enrique, from the back of the room, looked at her with restrained pride. He knew that at that moment, Marta was not only recovering her assets, but also the respect that her own son had stolen from her. When the meeting ended, Fabiana left the room in a flurry of insults and threats. Rodrigo stood motionless, staring at his mother as if seeing her for the first time. "Forgive me," he said through tears. Marta looked at him in silence for a long moment before responding. "I don't forgive you yet, Rodrigo, but I'm giving you the opportunity to do it yourself, with your actions." Then she stood up and left the office, accompanied by Enrique. Outside, the afternoon was falling over São Paulo with a warm, golden, almost symbolic light. For the first time in a long time, the air smelled of freedom. Over the following weeks, Marta kept the legal process active, but with a new intention. Not to destroy, but to restore. With the help of Enrique and Ottavio, she established a formal agreement that placed all shares and properties under her temporary control. Rodrigo, bound by the court terms and his own conscience, moved into a small apartment and began therapy with his children. Fabiana, facing criminal charges, disappeared from the family environment. The silence she left behind was strange at first, but also necessary. At Enrique's house, Marta began to rediscover things she thought she'd forgotten. The soft music of the piano, the scent of the orchids he tended in the garden, the simple pleasure of having breakfast without fear of disturbing others. Life, she reflected, doesn't always give back what one has lost, but sometimes it offers something more valuable: peace. And if you've made it this far, maybe this story is also stirring something in you. Tell me where you're listening to it from. Sometimes sharing where we feel things reminds us that we're not alone in this world. As the months passed, Marta settled into a calm and orderly routine. She helped with small sewing projects for a foundation for older women, taught embroidery classes, and, some afternoons, accompanied Henrique to meetings at the company, which she now co-directed. She discovered that he still had a sharp mind for numbers and a firm intuition for people. His presence commanded respect, not because of authority, but because of history. Rodrigo slowly began visiting her. The first few times were awkward, filled with awkward silences, but with each encounter, the weight of guilt gave way to a shy, almost childlike tenderness. Marta listened to him without judgment, though she still didn't hug him. She knew that forgiveness wasn't an act, but a process. Henrique, for his part, never left her side. His love was patient, discreet, undemanding. They often walked together in the park at dusk, speaking little but feeling much. Sometimes she shared memories of her youth. Other times he showed her photographs of his deceased wife. There was no jealousy or comparison, only understanding between two souls who had survived loss. Marta understood that love, at her age, didn't require promises or grand gestures. All it took was someone who knew how to be silent when life had already said almost everything. It was then that she began to write their story, not to relive the pain, but to record that even after abandonment, one can still flourish. One autumn afternoon, while sorting through some old documents on Enrique's desk, Marta found a letter written by Alberto years before. It was addressed to her, but she had never received it. In it, her husband spoke of his fear that his generosity would be used against him, and asked her, no matter what, to never let money replace his dignity. Marta wept silently, not out of sadness, but out of gratitude. She understood that even in death, Alberto had tried to protect her the only way he knew how, with words. That night, she asked Henrique to light a candle for him. It wasn't a religious act, but a symbolic one, a final farewell to the past and a recognition of the man who, unwittingly, had taught her to endure. The following days were filled with calm. Marta started sewing again, not out of necessity, but for pleasure. Her hands, marked by the years, moved the needle with the same precision as always, but her mind was no longer focused on the pain. Each stitch became a silent affirmation. I am still here. Her grandchildren began to visit her more often, and little Pietro asked her to teach him how to sew on a button. That simple, everyday scene reminded her of the essential thing, that true love is not lost. It only changes shape. Marta had finally come full circle. Over time, Rodrigo managed to divorce Fabiana and regain some of his emotional stability. He began working at a smaller company, far from the Montenegro name, determined to build something of his own. Marta watched his progress with a mixture of pride and distance. She didn't congratulate him or scold him. She simply let him be. She understood that sometimes children must fall in order to learn to walk without the hand that always held them. Henrique, meanwhile, continued to invest in new projects with the participation of Marta, who was now an official shareholder and a respected figure in the business world. Her name, previously erased by manipulation, once again had weight and meaning. It was as if the world finally recognized the woman who had always been there, invisible but indispensable. One Sunday afternoon, while they were drinking coffee in the garden, Henrique said to her, I never imagined that love could be reborn after so much silence. Marta smiled, looking at the newly opened flowers. Love isn't reborn, she replied. It only waits in the corners where one stops being afraid. They remained silent, watching the sunlight play through the leaves. In that instant, Marta understood that her story was not only one of loss and betrayal, but also one of transformation. She had gone from being the woman who asked permission to exist to the one who decided her own destiny, and that, she thought, was the greatest victory she could have. With her stability restored, Marta decided to use part of her resources to create a support fund for older women victims of family and financial abuse. She named it the Aguja y Alma Foundation, in honor of the two things that had sustained her throughout her life, her craft and her inner strength. Within a few months, the initiative began to grow. She received letters from all over the country, stories of mothers and grandmothers who had been betrayed by their own children, or robbed of what they had built. Marta responded to each one personally, with slow and elegant handwriting. In each letter, she repeated a phrase that became her signature. Silence is not kindness, it is surrender, and no woman came into the world to give up. What had once been her pain had now become her cause. Years later, Enrique's house had become the home Marta had always dreamed of. It didn't have excessive luxuries or grand displays, but it brimmed with peace. In the main living room, a black and white photograph of Alberto hung next to another of the smiling grandchildren. Sometimes, when the sun shone through the high windows, the reflection of both images met on the wall, as if the past and future embraced without conflict. Rodrigo visited often, now with a different demeanor, humble, grateful. The relationship between mother and son had gone from distance to silent understanding. They weren't the same as before, but perhaps that was for the best. They had learned to love each other from truth, not from emotional debt. One winter morning, while preparing tea for Enrique, Marta paused in front of the dining room mirror. For a moment, she barely recognized her reflection. She was no longer the woman who had been thrown out of her house with a suitcase and a broken heart. She was a new woman, firm, calm, free. She smiled with a serenity she had never known. "We did it, Alberto," she whispered. And as the steam from the tea filled the air, she realized that her story, like every stitch she had ever sewn, had closed its last thread, leaving nothing loose. There was justice, there was love, and above all, there was peace.